Hello, and welcome to another Books You Can Sink Your Teeth Into podcast. I am your host, Granite A. Miller, and really happy to have you here with us today. This week, this podcast, we're going to review a book written by Mark Goodacre. It's called The Fourth Synoptic Gospel. The Fourth Synoptic Gospel, John's knowledge of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I'm going to put it up here for a second. I got referred to read this book uh, from the podcast I listened to with Dr. Bert Ehrman, and he was the one who recommended this, and so I got it. The author, Mark Goodacre, is a professor of religious studies at Duke University, specializing in New Testament and Christian origins. So I thought this would be good to read. It's very interesting, a very unique perspective. So what this book, if you enjoy reading about religious things like I do, then you'll definitely like this book. If this isn't your cup of tea, then don't. I wouldn't recommend reading this because you wouldn't. I don't. It's very technical. So this is pretty much written for people who are pretty serious about religion and reading about it, and it's not really meant for the lay person to read. It kind of makes a lot of assumptions of information that you would know. Some of it I did, some of it I didn't, but I found it to be very thought provoking. So the whole point of the book is uh, that. I have to first set the stage. So we know that there are three synoptic gospels. They are Matthew, Mark, Luke. And these three, see, I did a German, Matthew, Mark, Luke. I'd count the German way. Okay, that's a reference to a movie. All right, so back on track. Um, these three gospels are called synoptic because they are closely related to each other. In some cases, they are literally written word for word, verbatim, from one to another, copied from one to another. They follow the same pattern. They, say the same stories, etc. And that's why they call them synoptics. There's a lot of speculation, a lot of scholarly research about who was written first, who was written second, who was written third, who copied off of who. Is there a cue or a source document that was used to write these three, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, etc. Lots and lots of scholarly debate and opinions and theses that go on with it. But what we do know, pretty much standard right now, is that Mark was written first about 30 to 40 years after the death of Jesus. Then after that came either Matthew and then Luke, or Luke and then Matthew. Some people say that there's a Q source, and the Q source means that Matthew copied from Mark, Luke copied from Mark and Matthew, but there are points in both Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark. So there must be another source then that they copied from. That's the Q source, German for Quelle source. And what this book does, this book says no. First of all, he says that really there is no Q source. That he proposes that Luke copied from Matthew and Mark, and that's not really the point of this. But what he's saying is that John, the Gospel of John, also knew the Synoptic Gospels and borrowed extensively from them. Now, we all know that when you read the Gospel of John, it's completely different from the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are basically what's called low Christology, which means that Jesus was born as a human, like we see him born as a baby. So he was born as a human, and then, depending on which gospel you read, became who he was, either from the baptism or what. So, but in John starts off with in the beginning was the Word, meaning that that this is high Christology, meaning Jesus started up here and then came down to earth, but there's no birth narrative or anything in John. So it's called high Christology. In the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is constantly telling people, don't say who I am. Don't tell anybody about this. He won't perform miracles on demand when he's asked. But then conversely in John, Jesus can't stop talking about himself, and he's also performing miracles to prove who he is. So just completely different stories, and all, and that kind of led people to assume that, yeah, John was written completely, did not have any reference to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what uh, Professor Goodacre is doing is he's saying, no, that's not the case. John did know, and he makes a lot of good points in here about that. Yeah, really convincing. Some of the things that he wrote about, saying that, yeah, that he did have knowledge of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke when he wrote. And as we know, John was written quite late, maybe even like 90 to 100 years later. So it makes sense that these other Gospels were around. One of the things that we've got to keep in mind, and I want to point something out, is that, today we've got the New Testament, right? It's in what we call the Bible. We have the New Testament, and these are composed of letters from Paul and extended books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, etc. But these were not compiled until like the third or fourth century, is when they finally officially put these together and made what we know today as the New Testament, and came to agreement on it. So back in the first century, right, they did not have all these books together and the letters from Paul, etc., together to refer from. In fact, there were a number of different Gospels. We talked about this on when we read the Gnostic book, about how there were like the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, the Revelation of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, et cetera, et cetera. And there were, even there was a completely gospel written by Marcion that was really popular and used. And so, were these things floating around, and did people have access? I think John did. I agree with the author here, but I also think John had access to other material as well. Maybe the gospel that was composed by Marcion could have been one. We don't know, of course, but the author here is basically limiting himself to, references from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So he does a really good job of doing it. So it's a very good book. Very technical, very scholarly, very detailed. I enjoyed it. For one, I enjoyed it. Again, if you're interested in these type of things, talk about religion, et cetera, like that, yeah, then I would recommend this. It's definitely a good book to read, and it gives you a lot to think about. Now, did it change my mind? No, it didn't. I still feel that there's a separation, right? You have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then John was just its own complete, unique book. But I can agree, yeah, that there must have been some references, maybe, but I don't know if he had like copies of Mark and Matthew and Luke in front of him and knew how he was working. I don't think that was the case. I think that maybe there was a lot of like oral tradition. Maybe he heard, maybe there was a letter. I don't know. I think he had. I do think he proves that there were some sources that were used. But yeah. But anyway, that's just my opinion. And my opinion and 50 cents will not buy you a cup of coffee, so take it for what it's worth. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. This is all that we're going to do today for this podcast. No Count Vlad, no silliness today, just doing this one on this book. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us. Until next time.